All right, it is time to talk about the DAW. You've probably heard me mention this before. You probably have one. But what is this mystical, magical piece of software? Let's get digital. DAW is an abbreviation for Digital Audio Workstation. As stated at the beginning of week 1, you can use whichever DAW you want for this course, if it is Ableton Live, Logic Pro X, or Reaper. I will help you out as much as possible with how to do whatever in the DAW, but I am going to focus more on concepts that can transfer between programs rather than specific programs. There's a good reason for this. It teaches you to learn transferable concepts that can help you land a job anywhere, and you don't get bogged down in one specific program that may or may not be used elsewhere. You get to pick your favorite from the list, use it again, and again, it is concept-based. The downside is you might need to email me or occasionally Google a solution, and for some things, you may have to use the computers in the lab. Sorry. So what is a DAW? It is a multi-track recording program that lets you record, edit, process, and mix digital audio data and MIDI. So, major features: record audio. Typically, the number of channels you can simultaneously record is limited by your audio interface, and a total track number that you will have that's limited by the program itself. So, the non-HD Pro Tools version, you're limited to 32 channels simultaneously, just as an example. You can import audio from a variety of file formats by drag and drop, or import directly from a CD or DVD drive, as if computers have those anymore. Some older or proprietary formats will not work, though, so be aware of that. You might have to actually record them. They can also let you synthesize audio. Most DAWs come with the ability to enter and edit MIDI data from a keyboard using the QWERTY computer keyboard or with a pencil tool, and most, but not all, Reaper being the exception, also come with a variety of synthesizers, sample-based instruments, etc., so that you can take your MIDI data and transform it into audio. The quality of those instruments can vary considerably, and you will still want to purchase some external ones as well. So common parts of a DAW are things like the transport controls. These are the standard playback, stop, rewind, fast forward, record. Typically, they are modeled after the analog controls from tape decks, and from there, they just went digital. They also have clocks. This is the time display. It can be either in bars, beats, subdivisions as above, where you have 1.1.1, or it could be in SMPTE time codes, which divides a second into frames per second, which is very useful in video. Or they can be set to actual time using hours, minutes, seconds. Most DAWs will let you decide what format to display for the clock, including multiple formats. Typically, you just need to right-click the clock to set the display. Other DAWs will have one static clock type, or one type at a time, but will display multiple rulers with different time formats in their edit timeline view. Tracks are the horizontal lanes that store audio or MIDI data in the DAW. You need one track per audio or MIDI input that you're using. DAWs have two main views. They have the edit view and the mix view. Edit or arrangement view or timeline view displays the tracks horizontally, and it shows regions or clips of audio or MIDI data in the track. These are the chunks that can easily be moved around from one place to another on similar tracks. So you can move mono audio track data to another mono audio track. You can move stereo audio clips from one stereo track to another, but not onto a mono audio track. You can move MIDI to any MIDI track, but never to an audio track. The mix or session view displays a standard view of channel strips very similar to a mixer. It's meant to emulate a mixer channel for every single track. In Ableton and in Logic, you can also launch clips in this view, which are just predefined bits of audio or MIDI, usually looped, but not always, that you can fire off in order to create a performance. Common to each view, you're going to have the same controls for record, enable, or ARM, mute, and solo for every track. You'll also find input-output assignments, but they may or may not be hidden on the timeline for some programs. You'll probably have to menu dive a little bit to show those if you really want them on there. I prefer to keep those kind of out of sight after I've set up my session. In a number of DAWs, the tracks in Edit View are going to be at the top of the screen, and there you can make general edits like splitting a region, deleting a selection, consolidating regions, or applying fades. While below that, you'll have a region called the editor. This is very common in Ableton and in Logic. In the editor area, you can actually edit the audio or MIDI for things like note adjustments, warping of pitch or quantization, reversing the region, doing weird things to it, looping it, any of that stuff. All of this, though, is very important to point out, is what's called non-destructive editing. That is the standard for modern DAWs. You are not actually editing the audio file. You're not cutting it up into little bits and then rearranging them on the timeline. What you're doing is you're creating a set of instructions that are applied as the final audio is being rendered to a new file at the very end process when you go to bounce or render your audio. It is still possible to use destructive editing in some programs, but you have to really, really be sure you want to do this before it will let you do that. If you really, really want to, there's always a way, but it's usually a really bad idea unless you are 100% sure and you're doing it specifically to destroy something for creative purposes. So here is a copy of the edit view in Ableton Live. You can see we've got audio tracks displayed horizontally, and those tracks are showing MIDI on the top two, and they're showing audio on the bottom two. In the editor, on the bottom, you can see the MIDI notes in piano roll. It's been compressed quite a bit, so I can get as much of the screen as possible up there. But that is what you are seeing. In the mix view, again, this is the emulation of a channel strip, and it can be pretty direct. Things like Reason's emulation of the SSL console, or more abstract and kind of menu-based, like Ableton, Logic, or Reaper. But they all have some really common controls. The volume fader, which is the vertical strip that you can move the slider up and down on to increase or decrease the volume of the track. The 0 dB setting, also called unity, means that there is no volume being added or subtracted from the original recording. You are hearing it exactly at the level that it was recorded. Typically, the majority is going to be below that, going down to -70 or -infinity. And then a little bit above that, which will go to +6 or maybe +12 dB, depending on your program. This gives you a little bit of headroom to increase the volume beyond, but typically you're starting at the bottom of the mix and bringing things in from silence. Maybe not to that full unity or 0 dB level. It might be a little lower, but depending on what you have that you have to add in the mix. Next up is panning knobs. The panning knobs are dials that control the position of the track in the stereo field. And typically there is one knob on a mono track and two on a stereo track that describe an area of effect. For any of you who've played D&D, this is your area of effect spell. This is your cone of cold. You are defining the leftmost boundary and the rightmost boundary of the sound field and how it's positioned within that 180-degree space. This is the outer end of either side that gets affected. This can be a little confusing if you haven't used this before, but you'll get the hang of it pretty quickly, and it's very, very useful. It can make things sound very thin, or you can make it take up the entire stereo field. You also have send knobs, which control the percentage of the track's audio that's sent to the aux or return tracks for effect processing. Take a look at a couple of the channel strips from Ableton. At the top, you see MIDI or audio from, and it tells you what channel it's receiving from. Monitoring, which can be turned to off, auto, or input, where the audio is being routed to. In this case, they're all going to the master. Then below that, you have the send A and B knobs. So those send to aux track A and aux track B. Below that, you have the volume fader, which also integrates a little LED meter that shows the relative volume. And then over to the left of that, you have the panning knobs on every channel. Those are going to show you blue to the left if it's being panned to the left, or to the right if it's going to the right. On Ableton, you don't have dedicated mute buttons. You have those track activator numbers. If those are yellow, the track is not being muted and it's playing. If they are gray, then you'll notice that the volume and pan knobs will go gray as well, and you will not hear any sound. Below that is solo. Solo, when it is enabled on a track, lets that track play, and everything else is muted, unless it's also soloed. Then below that, you have the recording arm button. If that is not enabled, then when you hit record, nothing happens to that track. However, if it's enabled and you record, then it will overwrite or overdub whatever is on the track. So let's talk about that basic recording, sequencing, and editing, and how to make some noise in your DAW. The basic process to record audio is you set your mics. Connect them to the interface. Make sure that the input gain is completely down, as low as it will go. Turn on phantom power if needed. Then increase the inputs of your DAW tracks so that each track has the correct interface channel routed to it. Record enable. Set your gain to avoid clipping, and repeat going down the line until all the tracks' input gain is set. Then make sure that the correct tracks are record enabled. Reset the position in the DAW to the beginning or wherever you're starting the record from, and hit record. Sequencing is the basic process for recording MIDI. So before you even power on your DAW, make sure that your MIDI controller is plugged in and powered on. If you start your DAW and then plug it in, there is a very, very good chance that it will not come up in pretty much every DAW. So make sure that it's there, and then if it's the first time you've used it with the DAW, go into the preferences and make sure that it's enabled. For example, Reaper, by default, you can plug a MIDI controller in there, but it's not going to be enabled. You have to go in there and tell it. Once that's done, create a new MIDI track and load a virtual instrument on it. In Reaper, you will want to create virtual instrument on track. You don't want to just create a MIDI track. You want to create virtual instrument on track. Once that's done, record enable the track so you can test the instrument, play a couple of keys, make sure you're getting sound, and make any adjustments to the virtual instrument if needed. Then make sure, again, that the track is record enabled, reset the position to where you want to start the recording, and hit record. From there, remember that most DAWs will let you overdub MIDI, so you can add in multiple passes, and you can quantize and fix rhythmic errors. This is super, super useful. It means that if you're like me and you're not good at drumming, you can go through and you can record just the bass drum, then do another pass, overdub on top, record the snare. Go back, do another pass, add the toms, and then gradually build up your entire kit. For editing, every DAW is different, but there are some basic concepts that go across all of them. Basic edits: cut, paste, duplicate. Splitting and consolidating regions so that you cut it in half and then you can move one end one way, one end the other way, or that you're gluing two regions together. Reversing an audio or MIDI clip or region, or individual notes. Fading and crossfading. Mixing, specifically using volume and panning to position a sound. Using the send and returns to send audio to the same time-based effect so that it will all have that exact same effect and it won't drift out of sync. Really useful for things like delay and reverb in particular. Using pitch and time manipulation, which will have different names in every program. It will be warp mode in Ableton, flex time in Logic, Elastic Audio in Pro Tools, and stretch in Reaper. All of these allow you to change the time and timing of regions, the pitch of audio within regions, independently of the time or not. This can get very fun. And you can add warp, flex, stretch, whatever they call them, markers, and use those to change how things are warped. Ableton is probably the best for this. It has the most warp modes hands down. So if you really want to get crazy, you can do some amazing stuff with that. Also, every DAW will allow you to do the most important thing, which is automating parameters. So you can set it up, add breakpoints, and then it will follow the breakpoints and move to different parameter values for the selected parameter based on where you put the breakpoints in the track. This allows you to ramp up the volume, fade it back automatically so you're not there physically moving controls. It's very, very useful. You can also insert effects onto the tracks, put them on return tracks, put them onto the master bus. Very useful for doing basic things like EQ, cleaning stuff up, or mangling the sound and, creating something really cool. And the most important part, every DAW, you can bounce or render your final audio track, at which point it takes a look at all the instructions you created, it takes a look at all the audio files and MIDI clips that you've got, and it goes through and builds the new audio file from those instructions. So, we're going to get through most of these over the course of the semester, leading up to the midterm. But for now, just as an experiment, to get a feel for what you know and what you don't know and what sounds cool, just play around in the DAW. Grab it, have fun, see what you remember, take a look at the cheat sheets that I've put up on Moodle and use those to experiment. If you don't know how to splice something, take a look. If you don't know how to separate a region, look at that, how to glue two regions, how to crossfade, etc. For extra practice, take a look at the activities on pages 60 to 72 in the book. It'll take you a couple hours to get through those, so this is kind of a good weekend exercise. But they've got some great explanations if you don't already know a particular technique. And at the least, read through those and come with questions at the next class.